Hey, welcome back to our second speaker session of the day. Before we get started and giving people a chance to move over from the last session, we'll do a little bit more trivia. Just like earlier, make sure that you put your answer down into the group chat and we'll give it a whirl. I wonder if there will be more Great Lakes style trivia. How many quadrillion gallons of water are in Lake Superior? Dee, 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 dee. Dee, dee, dee. Dee, 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 dee. How many quadrillion gallons of water in Lake Superior? And David P. Oh, no, wait, hold on. Todd Sorensen guessed 42. He's wrong. Adam N. got this correct with 3 quadrillion. That's a lot of zeros. Adam, yep, there. If you could just email Katie and she will get you your wonderful CUGC charger. All right, the second question. This will be also for another beautiful CUGC charger, limited edition. What is the name of the world's largest salt mine? What is the name of the world's largest salt mine? Now trending on Google searches, salt mines. We have a guess of Cargill. That is not correct. Josh M. Godric Salt Mine is correct. Josh M., you are correct. Luke Stonstegard, it is not a compass. It's a salt mine. Nice job. Nice job, everybody. All right. So we do have one of our sponsors has a segment to talk about for Nutanix. This is going to be introduced. This will be Keys Baggerman, one of the smartest people I've ever got to meet. So please enjoy.
Welcome to today's session, Nutanix Technical Introductions in 5 minutes or less. My name is Kees Baggerman, and I'm a Technical Director for End User Computing within Nutanix. I've got a blog, a Twitter feed, and an email stream. If you want to hit me up with questions later on, then feel free to do so. Now, if you look at Nutanix as a company, you'd see that we have one platform for any app and any cloud, where there's a strong focus on long-term sustainable growth with multiple products, both on the platform, on the application, and cloud agnostic side. We've defined the 4 Ds within our portfolios. So we started off with digital hyperconverged infrastructure services. That's our bread and butter. That's where our virtualization, our storage, management and operation and security is hosted. Then we've designed the data center services business unit that holds the storage components of objects and other storage related services, networking and business continuity and disaster recovery. Then there's DevOps services that will offer cloud-native applications, automation with Calm, our automation and orchestration lifecycle management, and there's database as a service as well. And last but not least, there's a business unit called Desktop Services, and that will cover end-user computing, DaaS, and digital workspace. All of that, we do that across both private cloud and public cloud, and that's where I wanted to talk to you about today. So if we look at the case for hybrid cloud deployments, we actually saw that based on IDC and Enterprise Cloud Index, that 85% of the enterprises continue to rank that hybrid cloud model as the ideal operating model. 73% of the respondents were migrating applications away from public cloud back to an on-premises infrastructure. And 60% of the respondents said that security was the biggest factor impacting enterprises' future for cloud strategies. And if you combine all of that, obviously Nutanix always had a stronghold in the on-prem data center solutions with our HCI core foundation. But looking forward, it would make sense to kind of offer something that enables you to build a bridge to hybrid cloud. And that's basically what we're doing. So if we specify this for end user computing and we're looking to that one workload a little bit closer, you would see that our hyperconverged infrastructure is a perfect match for desktop services, being server VDAs or desktop VDAs, it doesn't really matter. Private cloud and public cloud operated by the same management plane, same look and feel, and the same tool set that you would use on-prem and in public cloud. Simplifying your deployment, simplifying your golden image management, which has always been a tough situation to be in. If you leverage on-premises solutions and you burst into public cloud, then you have to do image management for each and every public cloud, spread it across regions. It kind of inherent complexity when you look at it. And we as Nutanix can simplify that. Now, how are we simplifying this? Looking at the integration points that we have, we've got a plugin for MCS. So if you look at the hypervisors that we support, it's vSphere, ESX, it's Microsoft Hyper-V, and there's Nutanix AHV. And Nutanix AHV is our own built-in hypervisor. And together with Citrix, we developed a joint solution to deliver the provisioning methodologies from Citrix onto Nutanix AHV. And for that, we created an MCS plugin. We've created the PVS plugin, so you can utilize both MCS and PVS on our platform. And there's a CVAT service plugin via Prism. And last but not least, there's a plugin for Director as well, which enables you to kind of get the details of your AHV underlying platform and get the performance details that you need. So all in all, if we look at how we differentiate for end-user computing, it's the platform of your choice. So pick your own broker, version, hypervisor, and platform. Doesn't matter which hardware vendor you're preferring. We have a OEM model that helps you define and pick the right platform for you. There's a per user pricing model to match infrastructure costs to the EUC licensing models that we see in the field. Linear scalability, and this is something that that I think is very valuable. So we can scale from hundreds to 10,000 VMs with linear performance, and we have that documented in our reference architectures. We've got videos on YouTube, so please have a look and see for yourself. And last but not least, we have a complete end-user computing solution. So people always look at end-user computing as a fully assembled stack, and that's what Nutanix is doing with integrated file shares, security with our network segmentation called Flow, and now clusters as well. So building that hybrid bridge is something that we're dedicated to. And with that, I'd like to thank you. If you're interested in our technology stack or just want to hear more, we've got a virtual booth with the Nutanix team waiting for you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that, Nutanix. Up next, we have our second speaker of the day, Sara Steinhoff. She is the Vice President of Computing Services for North America, here to talk to you today. Take it away, Sara.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Sara Steinhoff. I've been at Citrix for going on 14 years now, so I currently manage a team of consulting architects, and I myself was in the field for a number of years, primarily focused on the configuration of our virtual apps and desktop suite of products. Obviously, Citrix is very focused on Citrix Cloud and cloud services moving forward, so a lot of our projects over the past couple years have geared more and more towards deploying Citrix Cloud virtual apps and desktop service and pivoting customers from existing on-prem deployments into those cloud services. So I wanted to take some time today to share some lessons learned from some of those recent cloud engagements, because I think it is very tempting for customers that have existing on-prem CVAD deployments to think that migration to Citrix Cloud can be quite easy, because how different can on-prem CVAD and CVAD service be? There is a great amount of feature parity there. But I think there are some key differences when thinking about a traditional on-prem CVAD deployment and Citrix Cloud. So I wanted to focus on really diving into some of those deltas that have tripped some customers up, as opposed to doing some kind of holistic overview over what Citrix Cloud is and how it works, but really what that difference is between on-prem CVAD and CVAD service. So we'll be starting with the early planning phases of selecting what other products, combination of products and cloud services you may choose to deploy alongside Citrix Cloud, CVAD service. So I'm going to be looking at that access tier, right? That choice between storefront and gateway versus workspace and gateway services. Then looking at the architecture of CVAD service itself. So this really becomes a multi-site versus multi-zone discussion as a key differentiator between on-prem CVAD and then CVAD service. Sorry, 1 second. Looks like we have some webcam difficulties. Try off and on again.
Sorry, just making sure that you all can hear me and see me. All right, but this is better. So starting with kind of planning your storefront and workspace, and then looking at that site versus zone architecture. Then once we kind of know what products and services we'll be using together with CVAD service, as well as the design of that service, we'll get into the configuration of CVAD service. So is that going to be a kind of a two-pronged approach of both migrating features from an on-prem environment into the service using the automated configuration tool, but then also evaluating what new features and functionality may only be available in the Citrix Cloud that a customer may choose to implement, and then wrapping up with some operational considerations. So looking into how the administration and management of Citrix Cloud CVAD service differs from the traditional on-prem CVAD deployment. I know operations may not be as technically sexy as some of the other nuts and bolts of how CVAD service operates, but I think it really is important to not lose track of operations and monitoring when it comes to a CVAD or CVAD service deployment. In my experience, no matter how well architected and built a given environment is, it's not going to be long-term successful if we don't have the right operational procedures set up to support and maintain that platform long-term. And then throughout, feel free to post questions in the chat. I'll get to them when I can. That's really, there should be some extra time at the end. So getting started with our early planning phases. Obviously, if a customer has chosen to deploy CVAD service, there's certain components of the architecture that are already decided for you, right? You know what you're doing with the SQL database, delivery controller, director, that's all baked into the service. There's not a lot of choice there. But being Citrix, we provide a lot of choice for what you do with the other components that typically integrate in with that platform. And a really important one that we see all the time is what you decide to do with your access tier. So whether a customer chooses to continue to leverage an on-prem gateway and storefront, or if they're going to use workspace service. So workspace and gateway services being other cloud services. If you choose to deploy those as your access point alongside CVAD service, your architecture is going to look similar to what's shown on the left side of the screen. If you choose to continue to leverage an on-prem gateway and storefront, it'll look similar to what's shown on the right. We get asked all the time to put together some kinds of pros cons list between storefront and workspace and kind of commit to one being better. If you've done any work with consulting, you know that the answer is always that it depends. So we really like to craft this conversation and decision around the use case and the requirements of the users, and really three main design tenets, being resiliency, authentication requirements, and service integration, meaning what resources do you want to have available to your users after they log in? Is it just apps and desktops, or is it also files, SaaS applications, that kind of thing?
So starting with resiliency probably being the most important consideration for many customers, Citrix Cloud as a platform, so all hosted services, offers a 99.9% SLA. That is up from 99.5 as of October last year. So workspace service being part of Citrix Cloud platform, that SLA also applies to workspace service, but that means that it's not 100%. At some point in time, we should all expect that a cloud service is going to be unavailable. And for workspace service, that is a user impactful outage because the web page that they would go to log in to access their resources is not reachable. So what's being done to help address that is something called service continuity that is currently tech preview. And the idea behind service continuity is that it works together with Workspace app to store lease files on the user endpoint. That would allow for enumeration to continue even if the Workspace service website's unavailable. So after the user logs in once, all the resources they see are effectively cached locally. So if Workspace service is subsequently unavailable, they can continue to open Workspace app and we'll see all their apps and desktops. There's some caveats there that we'll get into next. But on the flip side, if we take a look at a storefront-based access tier, obviously, storefront sits outside of Citrix Cloud, so that SLA does not apply to it. How often storefront is up or down really depends on the customer to maintain that server. But that storefront server does communicate with cloud connectors that communicate up to the CVAD service. If the CVAD service were to ever go down, those cloud connectors have a local host cache, much in the same way on-prem CVAD delivery controllers do. So if there is a cloud outage, and you are using storefront, obviously users can continue to access storefront to authenticate. Storefront would then communicate with your cloud connectors that would leverage local host cache to allow those users to continue to see their resources as well as launch new sessions. So pretty resilient there. There was a feature enhancement added in 1912 CU1 with storefront that allows storefront to have a more intelligent view of a multi-zone environment that allows for better launch success in LHC mode, and we'll get into that in a little bit as well. But those are kind of your main resiliency pros and cons between those two choices. So kind of double clicking on service continuity because this is a new feature. This does work with Workspace apps. So of course it has Workspace app side requirements in terms of version and platform. So right now it's limited to Windows and Mac based endpoints. Those connection leases that are stored the very first time a user connects, obviously that user has to connect using Workspace app. Right? They can't connect in through a web page. They need to connect through Workspace app. But those leases are subsequently stored in the user profile within App Data Local. So if that user is roaming between multiple devices and that folder is not following them, or if you think about kiosk scenarios where there really isn't a user-specific profile, then this solution may not meet the needs of all use cases. The session launch itself, obviously, what this is doing is allowing a user to see their apps and desktops within Workspace app, but once they click on an app or desktop, that session launch must either be direct to the VDA or go through Gateway service. We don't support launch requests through Citrix Gateway. Also, because the user hasn't actually authenticated, right, because Workspace service was down in this scenario, they will be prompted to log into that VDA once that session has connected. So again, some caveats here. We like to talk about service continuity as a multi-phased rollout and support. So not all use cases and all scenarios are going to be captured as kind of part of this V1 version of this. There's going to be multiple iterations of this as we continue to expand to support more use cases, more endpoints, that kind of thing. So I've had a lot of customers that have been eagerly anticipating service continuity, and we're disappointed that not all their use cases were captured as part of this initial offering. But those will come with time. This is not it. So there is more to come here as we continue to expand the resiliency of Workspace service. Flipping back to storefront, because I kind of glossed over that point about this enhancement allowing for more accurate launch requests. I do have a lot of customers that are using storefront with CVAD service simply because they're more comfortable with retaining more ownership of that access point to start before continuing to consume more cloud services. So this has come up a lot. Kind of a little known limitation in multi-zone architectures users, and we'll talk more about multi-zone later as well. But generally speaking, when you have multiple zones, Storefront can talk to all connectors, all controllers across all zones. Any connector or any controller in any zone can enumerate resources across all zones. So Storefront could talk to one controller or one connector, and it can enumerate effectively site-wide or service-wide, right? That connector or controller can also, during normal operation, broker a connection to a VDA in any other zone. So that's kind of what's shown on the left there. If Storefront talks to a controller in one zone, but the actual user is going to a VDA in another zone, that VDA will accept the launch request, no big deal. The caveat in LHC mode, so if those cloud connectors lose connectivity to Citrix Cloud, same thing would apply on-prem if your delivery controllers lost connectivity to the SQL server. Those cloud connectors can still enumerate site and service-wide, but they can only broker connections to a VDA that is in the same zone as it. So it's really important that Storefront be able to direct that session launch request to an XML server, so cloud connector or delivery controller, in the same zone as the target VDA. If it just does it randomly, then you're going to get launch failures in LHC mode. So the enhancement that came out in 1912 CE1 was an enhancement that allowed Storefront, using the advanced health check, to receive a mapping of zone membership for all VDA resources and all cloud connectors. So that way, when a user clicked an app or clicked a desktop, it could correctly route that brokering request to a cloud connector that was in the same zone or resource location as the target VDA for that session. That way we have a higher rate of success for that session launch versus if it would just randomly picked a cloud connector from its list, which may or may not be in the same zone. So main takeaway here, I know I went kind of technical rabbit hole there, but main takeaway here is that if you're using Storefront with CVAD service and have multiple zones, we always recommend at least 1912 CE1 and turning on that advanced health check because it just provides better protection in LHC mode. All right, that was a lot on resiliency, but the next item that we tend to talk about when it comes to Workspace versus Storefront is authentication. I know a lot of folks think about Workspace service as Storefront in the cloud, but really it's a brand new product, and therefore there's a much bigger feature parity gap between Storefront and Workspace service than there is between on-prem CVAD and CVAD service. And one of the main gaps was and continues to be supported authentication methods. So all the authentication methods for both are listed on the slide. I'm not going to read them out, but obviously there's some differences there. Outside of the individual methods, kind of one thing I want to call out is that a lot of customers with on-prem, Storefront and gateway deployments are used to a user experience where internally, when the user's on the network, they go direct to Storefront, they get presented with one set of authentication methods, but externally, they go to Citrix Gateway, and therefore they have a different authentication experience. With Workspace service, there's currently no native context awareness when it comes to authentication. So any user, no matter where they are, whether they're in the office, at home, in Starbucks, if they come to Workspace service, they're getting the same authentication experience, same authentication methods applied to them. Some of the IDPs that Workspace service integrates with do provide that context awareness, so you can kind of back your way into that same thing if you hand off authentication to something like Azure AD that has, context awareness built into it for authentication to provide a differentiated experience. But natively, that functionality just isn't there yet with Workspace service. So that's kind of something I feel like a lot of CVAD customers take for granted. So it's important to call out when thinking through that user experience when deciding between Workspace and Storefront. Last item here being that service integration. So as I mentioned, Workspace service being a completely new product, it really was designed with cloud in mind, meaning that if you want, besides just your apps and desktops, if you want to see files, SaaS apps, tasks via micro apps, all that is possible via Workspace service, whereas Storefront was really purpose-built with CVAD in mind. So it can enumerate from on-prem CVAD, as many sites as you want, as well as CVAD service, but it can't pull in all that extra stuff around the files and the SaaS apps and things. So if you have those additional services and want to provide that a single unified UI for your users, then Workspace Service may be the better choice. So obviously there are other considerations there, but those, by the time we kind of work through those three main criteria, most customers have a good feel for whether Workspace Service or Storefront is going to meet their needs. So hopefully at the end of that, you now have a complete inventory of what combination of products and cloud services you need to successfully deploy your CVAD service environment, and we can get into the architecture of CVAD service itself. As I mentioned, there's a great deal of feature parity at this point between on-prem CVAD and CVAD service, but a big differentiator that we see continues to be this concept of multiple sites versus multiple zones. So if you have worked with CVAD for many years, you have probably seen this diagram. I stole it from a blog article, but it speaks to a concept known as pod architecture, which is something that Citrix Consulting has been preaching for many, many years at enterprise customers. The idea behind pod architecture was that at scale, if you wanted to deploy CVAD on-prem, instead of continuing to add more and more users into a single site, you would spread those users out over multiple sites to help limit the failure domain associated with that site database, because we all know SQL Server goes down. When it goes down, things get ugly. So we want to spread that failure out across multiple sites that are then aggregated, formerly Web Interface, now at Storefront. When we pivot to thinking about Citrix Cloud, the equivalent of that CVAD site would be an instance or a tenant of the CVAD service. And we're really encouraging customers as much as possible to minimize the number of CVAD service instances that they support and maintain. There's a couple reasons for this. Licensing is one of them, but technically speaking, there were code changes that we made in CVAD service around that cloud connector communication. So it is possible with CVAD service to have zones that span multiple continents, because those cloud connectors communicate back to that central service effectively via web traffic over the internet that is a lot more latency tolerant than that SQL traffic between a delivery controller and an on-prem database could ever be. So there were things that are simply not possible to do with on-prem CVAD in terms of geographic distribution of zones that is possible to do with CVAD service. And if we can consolidate all those resource locations into one service instance, we now have a lot of benefits when it comes to management, and that we can see everything in that one console, apply similar settings and that kind of thing. So we're really encouraging customers as much as possible to consolidate down to a single tenant for CVAD service, which may mean that we are now merging in data from multiple on-prem CVAD sites and therefore have a much heavier dependency on zones. That being said, there are very good and legitimate reasons why a customer may need multiple tenants. First and foremost, there are scalability limits to the CVAD service. These are publicly documented on our eDocs page. The screenshots that you see are taken from that website, and these are updated and maintained all the time. So I would strongly encourage everyone to always check the latest scalability numbers before deploying CVAD service. The two that we tend to run into the most often are the number of VDAs for 40,000, which may sound like a lot, but if you have a VDI environment, right, you could hit that number, as well as number of end users for our large enterprise customers, currently capped at 75,000. To give you a sense of context, at the beginning of 2020, that end user limit was sitting at 25,000, and it tripled over the course of 2020. So these numbers are always changing. Scalability is something that our product team is working actively on. So don't take a screenshot of these numbers and quote me on them in 6 months, because they'll be different. So always check the web page. It is kept up to date on what those limits are. But obviously, if you're planning to exceed the limits of a single service instance, then you'll need multiples of them. Another reason you may have multiple service instances would be if you want complete separation from a management and licensing perspective of different, business units or instances. So think about things like data sovereignty requirements or dev test tenant that you want to be completely separate from your production environment. So those would be, legitimate reasons that you may want to consider multiple service instances, but probably 9.9 times out of 10, our customers are going to have a single instance of CVAD service, which means we all need to get a lot more comfortable with zones and what that means. And one A misconception that I see a lot of customers tripping over is that they assume that a cloud connector kind of sits within a bubble within its resource location and only has access to information in that same resource location. All cloud connectors in all resource locations all have access to the same master data set in this central CVAD service in the database. So just like I said before, you could point Storefront to one cloud connector and see apps and desktops across all resource locations and all zones. The information that cloud connector has is not specific to that resource location. How I've seen this play out, though, is that customers within Storefront list each resource location, each zone, effectively as a separate site within Storefront. Each of those cloud connectors, though, enumerates all resources service-wide, which means you now end up with 3, 4, 5 versions of your apps and desktops enumerating within Storefront because you now have duplicate data sets. So it's always important within Storefront that we mimic the site architecture within that delivery controller definition. So if you have one CVAD service instance, that should be one site with all your cloud connectors listed within it, and leave it up to Storefront to route the enumeration and launch requests appropriately. This may also mean that if you have multiple sites managed by discrete business units within your organization, they may need to do some deduplication of resources because you may have Office currently published independently in all of those sites. That we just want to make sure we aren't publishing the same app now to everyone multiple times. So it may require some application inventory to be done just to make sure we're keeping things as clean as possible in this new CVAD service environment. A lot of customers that also went down the multi-site path on-prem heavily leveraged Storefront's multi-site aggregation settings to help distribute users across all of those sites. Now that we have one site, there's no multi-site aggregation. So we fall back to the zone-based controls that are available within CVAD and CVAD service that can get you some of the way of what was also possible with multi-site aggregation. So to review, using zone-based controls, you can assign a zone preference or a home zone to either users or apps. That means if users have access to resource in multiple zones, when they launch a session, it will be preferred to one zone. Caveat here being is that it's not an ordered list. So if you have 5 zones, you can't assign a first preferred, second preferred, third preferred, fourth preferred, right? You're assigning one home zone, and then same thing for apps. That zone preference also cannot be applied directly to desktop workloads. So you would have to apply it to the users who access those desktops. A way that we can work our way towards that ordered list is using application groups. So specifically for application workloads, if you have delivery groups that are separated by zone, you could define an umbrella application group that can then list delivery groups in priority order. So if your goal is to fail users over across multiple zones, you can achieve that somewhat with application groups, or load balance them if you set the priority equal across all those locations. So as we can see, slightly different, for customers that are used to managing multiple sites and have defined operational procedures around it, it is going to be a little bit different depending more on zones, but we can get most of the way there with some of those zone-based controls. So now that we know what products we're deploying, we've talked a little bit about the architecture of CVAD service, we can get into configuring it. And obviously thinking about a customer that has an on-prem CVAD environment and is moving up to Citrix Cloud, this is going to be that combination of taking what you already have and moving it up, as well as looking at what's new. So the key tool we have at our disposal here is the automated configuration tool. I know there's been a lot of community-driven content and tool sets out there around scripting that migration, but at least on the Citrix side, we're strongly recommending the automated configuration tool as an official vendor-developed supported tool. The idea behind the automated configuration tool is that it will run and export all the settings from a supported version of CVAD on-prem, so any site, and then can import those settings into a Citrix Cloud CVAD service instance. It can also export and import across CVAD service instances. So if you have multiple service tenants, it can help you synchronize those settings across those tenants. It leverages PowerShell, and as we'll can see, when you run the export, it stores the resultant files as YAML files. So similar to previous migration tools, if you are familiar with 6.5 migration tools and things that Citrix has released in the past, you can pick and choose what stuff you want to import. So we'll export everything, but you don't have to import everything. You can either delete files, edit files. So if you want to start with just importing your policies, for example, you can do that. The export results in YAML files that are created by configuration is kind of shown here. So you can always kind of pick and choose either which delivery group or even any delivery group that you want to migrate, and this can be run multiple times. All these are human readable and editable in Notepad. So just because you export it all doesn't mean you have to import it all at the same time. And we usually recommend more of a phased migration and upload like this. It can also be run multiple times against the same site. So if you're phasing your migration out across multiple weeks or even months, there's no limit to how often you can run the export and import process. So that's for getting existing settings up into the service, but what about net new features and functionality? There are some features that we have made cloud only for various reasons. Two of them, auto scale and vertical load balancing, that we're going to talk about, are really more applicable to public cloud workloads. So when you're putting your VDAs in Azure, AWS, GCP, etc. So they really only make sense to be made available within Citrix Cloud, since we're deprecating the ability for a customer to have an on-prem CVAD connected to a public cloud provider. So that's why those are cloud only. Rendezvous is not limited to CVAD service, but it is specific to workspace and gateway service-based connections. So I included it here because it wouldn't make sense for a purely on-prem customer to use Rendezvous. It doesn't do anything. It really only comes into play if you are using some Citrix Cloud services. So we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Autoscale is basically an enhancement on the existing power management capabilities that we've had for VDI-based workloads in CVAD for a long time. It extended those abilities to multi-user based workloads, so think RDS, and made them not just schedule, but also load based. So the idea here, if you're putting VDAs in a public cloud where you're paying based on consumption, then you are more motivated to power manage those effectively, because if you can shut the workloads down when they're not being used, then you aren't paying for them. So here you can either do it based on schedule or load, or a combination of those two. We usually recommend, similar to on-prem VDI, to avoid a boot storm, that you kind of phase these up in the morning so you get ahead of your users logging in. And then as they log off from the environment, your servers or your VDIs can then shut down at the end of the day. So similar considerations for those of you that have worked with on-prem VDI workloads. This isn't really anything new, but it is new for multi-user, and the fact that you can add load in there is helpful specifically for those multi-user scenarios. So it isn't just you having to monitor and manage a schedule. There's a little bit more dynamic nature of it, accounting for that load index. Vertical load balancing is a new feature that is CVAD service only, and it is only configured via PowerShell. It's disabled by default. And the intent here is really if cost is of paramount concern, this feature is designed to truly minimize the number of VDAs that are in use at any point in time. So if we think about traditional CVAD load balancing, we tend to distribute users horizontally, meaning as a new session comes in, we're always going to send that session to the least loaded VDA. That is the idea being that that VDA has the most capacity to handle that user, and they'll have the best experience that way. Vertical load balancing means that we're going to put all our users on one VDA until it reaches full capacity before using the next one. So it should minimize the number of VDAs being used at any point in time. The big risk there, of course, is that you black hole your VDAs if you have a big logon storm and all of a sudden everybody's crushing on one VDA and then it cycles through them. So we really only recommend this be tested and used with caution, because you really have to understand your logon patterns to make sure that you aren't doing damage to your environment and giving a bad user experience with this setting. But it is something that's really designed to minimize the cost associated with those machines. So if cost management is of paramount importance, this may be something that you consider when you have public cloud workloads and is specific to Citrix Cloud CVAD service. Lastly, just wanted to dive into Rendezvous. This is a little bit different because it's not CVAD service specific, but it is specific to workspace and gateway service. I feel like there's been a lot of communication on Rendezvous and it helping the user experience, but as a result, there's been some confusion around what scenario it applies to. So I have a lot of customers asking about Rendezvous who aren't using gateway service, and it really is specific to gateway service-based sessions. So Rendezvous, in a nutshell, the idea is that by default, if you are using gateway service for your user sessions, the traffic goes from the user device to gateway service, down through the cloud connector to the VDA. And what we saw was that those cloud connectors became bottlenecks to scalability. So you needed more of them to support the same number of user sessions, but also if something happened to that cloud connector, it got updated, it rebooted, etc. That user session and all the user sessions that are being proxied by that server now were impacted. So with Rendezvous, we bypass the cloud connector. So now you go from user to gateway service direct to the VDA. Obviously, some requirements there around the VDA having internet access, some minimum versions, but the idea behind Rendezvous is really improving that user experience and session performance when using gateway service specifically. All right, so that's kind of the technical nuts and bolts there around choosing the other peripheral components together with CVAD service, design of CVAD service, configuration of CVAD service. So now we're going to touch briefly on operations and management of Citrix Cloud. So firstly, getting into defining your admins. If you're familiar with Studio, you know that our delegated admin is that combination of roles and scopes. So you have your full admin, your read-only admin, your delivery group admin, that kind of thing. And then the scope of things that you apply those permissions to. Same idea in Citrix Cloud, except we broke apart the role and scope assignment. So when you add a new administrator to the Citrix Cloud platform, you give them a role at that point at the platform layer within the IAM section of Citrix Cloud. So it's not done within Studio. Within Studio, we still have scopes. So you can then map those administrative roles to specific scopes that you define within Studio, but the roles and scopes are actually set in separate places within Citrix Cloud. Currently, we only also allow individual user accounts to be added as admins. So this has been a couple of my customers where they have large help desks that they traditionally give director access to, but there's a lot of turnover within that help desk. There is currently a private tech preview looking to start to implement Azure AD-based user groups. That'll be the next kind of enhancement coming to the platform to allow for group management of administrators. But right now it is single user accounts only. So it's a little bit of overhead associated with managing those administrators. In terms of authentication for the admins, so not users, but the admins themselves, it's either Cloud Identity or it is Azure AD. Hence, Azure AD user groups being the next thing that we are targeting. But otherwise pretty similar. In terms of the consoles that those users would then have access to, Director is pretty much the same. For a while, Studio was the same. We were actually providing access to basically a hosted virtual version of Studio. So it was an HTML5 connection to a server running Studio. So it looked exactly the same. We have now webified that. So there's a brand new Studio console that is a native SaaS application. It's all the same settings. We, of course, moved them around, so it looks a little bit different, but it should perform much better. So we previously had limitations with the number of admins that could be concurrently connected, and obviously we're subject to the HTML5 receiver connection. So we've gotten a lot more better feedback about this new Web Studio version. So be prepared that if you haven't looked at Citrix Cloud in a while, the management console is going to be a little bit different. But otherwise, same settings as I mentioned before. The other kind of new component when we think about CVAD service is these cloud connectors. And they're in a bit of a unique position because the servers themselves are in the customer's owned and managed location. The servers are the customer's responsibility to stay up, stay patched, antivirus, all that good stuff. But there is software that sits on those servers that is maintained by a third-party vendor, namely Citrix. So we have kind of this hybrid management model, and there's been a lot of ongoing negotiation about how much control the customer has over what happens on those servers versus how much control Citrix needs to maintain platform stability. So currently it is possible within a Citrix Cloud Connector update schedule to specify a preferred day of week for those software patches to be deployed, as well as a preferred time of day. It's not possible to defer an update completely or define some kind of blackout period, but there is a little bit of a middle ground that you can define your preferred maintenance window for that software to be pushed down. But in order for us to maintain platform stability, we are continuing to push updates if and when they become available. So that was kind of the management pieces. Now dipping into monitoring of platform. There's various layers at which you can monitor the environment. There is service-wide alerts that you can subscribe to. So on status.cloud.com, we post uptime and availability of all services across all control planes, so US, EU, APJ, and US Gov. So at any time, if there is a service-wide issue, right, not just your tenant, but service-wide, you'd be posted to that page. You can subscribe to email-based notifications on an individual service and geo level. If you want to be notified of issues specifically to your tenant within your account settings within Citrix Cloud, you can also subscribe to warnings, informational, and error alerts related to your services. So if you want to know if there's an issue specifically impacting your tenant and any and all cloud services you may have, you would do it within your account settings. And then most specifically, if you want to continue to manage and monitor your CVAD service environment and the workloads that it hosts, you have the same director-based monitoring and alerting that you have on-prem. So you can set up email-based alerts from the director console to alert on things like CPU usage, memory usage, load index, logon duration, all that good stuff is all still available. One thing that was not true for a long time was the ability to integrate any kind of third-party monitoring solutions. So I have a lot of customers that have standardized on a variety of enterprise monitoring platforms. And we always encourage much as possible that a customer's CVAD and CVAD service environment be integrated into those existing tools. Because the last thing we want is for your Citrix platform to be some kind of special snowflake within your enterprise, because that's a recipe for things getting missed. As long as there's another dashboard or another place that you have to look for alerts just for Citrix, and you go someplace else for literally everything else, then you're going to forget about that special, unique dashboard. So as much as possible, we always want to make sure that your whole CVAD and CVAD service environment was also being monitored by those other standard tools so that the same operational procedures would apply to that environment and it was not unique. The problem was that a lot of the third-party monitoring tools out there to monitor CVAD effectively were relying on access to that site database. When that moved up into Citrix Cloud, it became a black box. You no longer had access to that information. But a lot of various vendors are developing solutions to address that gap. So there's Control Up is specifically referenced here, but there's a number of others out there. So I would definitely keep an eye on your monitoring solution of choice and see what offerings they have moving forward that would support Citrix Cloud. I think that can greatly extend the monitoring and alerting that's available with Citrix Cloud and CVAD service specifically. So it's less of a black box and you feel like you have the appropriate alerts and notifications for when things are working or when things are not working. Granted, also, the VDAs aren't changing. So I always recommend that you continue to do your standard monitoring and alerting on those workloads themselves to make sure that we aren't missing things like, event logs on the cloud connectors that would tell you when it's in LHC mode or not, high CPU, high memory, all that good stuff on your VDAs. And then if you have storefront, obviously your standard alerting on storefront as well will tell you a lot about what's going on in the environment. So to kind of sum up what we've gone through in the last 40 minutes or so, we talked about trying to identify when thinking about CVAD service using a combination of cloud services and standard, traditional on-prem products that best meet the needs of your end users. So that could mean going everything Citrix Cloud, or it could mean maintaining some mix of on-prem products as well as cloud services. Really understanding zone architecture when it comes to CVAD service is really critical. I know zones have been out there for a long time at this point with CVAD, but at least a lot of the customers that I work with still maintained a multi-site architecture that they had standardized on from early on. So we didn't really see that much adoption of zones, at least not at scale. But that's becoming more and more critical to understand and consider when it comes to CVAD service, and really think about how you want your users to connect to these various zones as well as failover across them, and what's doing that control, right? Is it storefront? Is it CVAD service, etc.? In terms of actually configuring CVAD, the automated configuration tool should take a lot of that manual effort off the table as a solution that can help you export and import settings across multiple on-prem CVAD sites into CVAD service, and can be run multiple times and iteratively if you're phasing out your migration over several weeks or months. And then lastly, just not to forget about operations. I know in a lot of our platform designs are really focused on the technical nuts and bolts of what check marks to check and all of that stuff. And it's easy to forget about long-term monitoring and operations, but it really is important for long-term success that you think about how some of your standard operating procedures are going to have to be updated when it comes to adopting a cloud service, and what things you will have access to and what things you will not, and how you want to compensate for the things that you will not have access to or will not have control over, or in the case of cloud connectors, will have joint control over. So that is all I had for today. I will answer any questions in the chat here, and then kind of hand it back to the remaining sessions here.
Sarah, we do have one question in the Q&A that was posted by Dwayne. Can you make more than one time schedule if you have 2 times per day a login storm could happen?
A question about if you can make more than one time schedule if you have 2 times per day and a logon storm could occur. So yeah, so when I think this was referring to when you had auto scale settings, so you can define different levels at different points of day if you want to do it schedule based. I think that's also the advantage of doing something load based, is that's a little bit more dynamic. So with load, you define like a buffer capacity that you want to maintain throughout the day. So that buffer capacity could, mean that you have more or fewer VDAs based on who's logged in. So if you have kind of 2 cycles of logon storms, it's an hourly schedule that you can configure to define, differentiation over the course of a 24-hour period, or weekdays versus weekends and that kind of thing. All right, and that's it. So I'll hand it over to you, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That was great. Look forward to some of these cloud options coming down the road. I know that's something we're starting to look into. Coming up next, we do have a quick word from one of our sponsors, and that comes from StrataDesk.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Severson. I'm one of the sales directors here with StrataDesk for the Americas region. And today we're going to discuss how StrataDesk mobilizes work from home. For those of you who don't know, Stratedesk is a visionary company behind the next generation software solution, No Touch. A blend of hyper-powerful endpoint management and Linux-based operating system, Stratedesk is redefining endpoint computing by delivering a cutting-edge endpoint management platform for VDI, desktop as a service, and IoT markets. Remote work, business continuity, and secure access to apps, data, and desktops from anywhere have become a top priority for organizations worldwide. Stratedesk delivers everything you need to enable your mobile workforce. No Touch OS and No Touch Center together are the #1 solution for deploying, managing, and monitoring thousands of on-premise and remote endpoints. How we enable work from home, or remote work in general, is with our No Touch OS, which is a Linux-based operating system for x86 or ARM architecture, specifically the Raspberry Pis. With that, we've added a new solution this year, which is our No Touch Goes. This is a bootable USB stick that comes preloaded with our OS on it and licensing included. No Touch Center is a centralized endpoint management platform, which is a lightweight OVA that can be deployed on a virtual machine, on-prem, or likewise can be deployed natively in the cloud with AWS or Azure. Likewise, we've included a new feature this year, which is our cloud extension, which is a simplified way of securely managing remote endpoints. The graphic here provides an overview of how you can deploy our No Touch solution, where No Touch Center can be deployed in the cloud with AWS or Azure. Again, we can host this for you, or you can host this within your cloud instance. Additionally, the OVA can be quickly stood up on-prem. With our cloud extension, you can easily provision and manage work from anywhere users while reducing vulnerability risks from opening a bunch of ports in your firewall. We offer unbeatable flexibility with the widest range of hardware and software support, managing both x86 and ARM architecture within a single pane of glass, solutions for both 32-bit and 64-bit environments. Our No Touch Center, again, can be deployed natively to the cloud. We have our cloud extension for simplified and secure remote management, flexible licensing and buying options, including both the No Touch OS and No Touch Center, along with a hands-off deployable methodology with the No Touch Center, where you can deploy the No Touch solution in minutes. We are hardware agnostic, supporting anything from x86, x64, 32-bit, 64-bit, and the ARM architecture with Raspberry Pi. Our hardware partners do include HP for the EMEA regions. You can get a select number of hardware offerings that they have, which comes with the No Touch OS preloaded. We have partnerships with LG for their all-in-one solutions, NVIDIA for the Jetson Nanos, and NComputing and ClearCube for x86 and Raspberry Pi offerings. Here's an overview of our Stratedesk ecosystem for a list of partners that we work with, including but not limited to Imprivata, Paradigm, partnerships for hardware like NComputing, ClearCube, LG, ongoing and growing relationships with Liquidware and Lakeside, ThinPrint for print management, and most importantly, we have a new relationship with Avaya to help provide a better end-user experience for call center deployments. So with that, guys, we'd like to strongly encourage you to visit our website, stratedesk.com/demo, where you can sign up and fill out a quick form. This will allow you to all-access licenses to be able to test every aspect of the deployment that you may have to meet your use case. We look forward to meeting with you guys and hopefully partnering soon. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Citrix, for having us. We're excited to be here, and we're excited to meet you. Have a good one.
All right, thanks to Stratadesk for that message. So what we do have coming up is our third speaker, Steve Greenberg. He'll want to go back to the lobby to talk about the adventure that 2001 is going to be for EUC. While you're there in the lobby, don't forget the passports and having some of those conversations. You do want to have those passport entries due in the next hour. 3:30 Central Time is when those entries are due. Otherwise, enjoy listening to Steve. Thank you very much, everybody.